Hey, welcome back. This is Randy here. This is the second of my occasional videos in my BCS series. I say occasional because it's been a bit since the first one, but I hope to have a little bit more of a regular cadence going forward. And you can probably see in the background one of the reasons why there was a bit of a time delay between videos, and that is I got a new game in the mail, Baptism by Fire, also BCS, and have really been enjoying playing not only this game but the system as well. So what I'd like to do in this video actually is to concentrate a little bit more on the counters that are involved in the game. And by using the counters, I'd like to explain a little bit about the rules. So instead of just kind of pouring through the rules and then kind of working backwards to the counters, I'd like to just have a little bit of a conversation about the counters themselves, and then we can kind of work into the new concepts that are contained in the game and kind of explain a little bit about what's going on. So what I propose to do is to divide this video up into two halves, and the first half is going to focus, as you can see here, on a specific formation in the game. Now, this game, BCS, Battalion Combat Series, is interesting in that whenever it's your turn, you actually activate an entire formation. So usually it's like a division size, and as the game's name BCS implies, you move the individual battalions that are contained in a division. And the way the game works is that there's a alternation back and forth between players, activating their own formations and then switching over to the other opponent to do the same. So what I'd like to do is just have a look at this specific formation, which I actually looked up in the rules, and this actually is not the entire Afrika Korps, but rather it's a constituent element called the Deutsche Afrika Korps Kampfgruppe. And this specific counter is, this actually is not a counter that's used in the game, but rather it's an identifier that you can either keep on the map so that you can see where your specific formations are at a glance, or there actually is an alternate system of activating the formations that adds a bit of randomness, and you would drop these into a cup and use a chit pull system if you chose to do so. So what I'd like to do is just look through this formation, just have a look and see what's going on here. So the first, and I would say the most important counter in this formation is its headquarters, which is identified with the same identifier, the dock, as you can see, that was on the lower left of the screen now, the formation counter. Okay, so focusing in on this center counter here, this actually is the formation's headquarters, and it's got a couple of numbers on it. The first number, the top number, the 12, that represents the HQ's command range. So you can imagine that kind of as the center point or locus of operations for the formation, the headquarters, as you start to radiate out from where the headquarters is, it's a little bit more difficult to have logistical command and control over units that are further away from the headquarters. And actually, this is an important number because, well, the designer, first of all, he seems to have expressed an intention that he wants formations to stay together as much as possible when playing this game. In fact, there are certain dice roll modifiers that penalize you if, like you do in other games, you allow your formations to get broken up and run all over the board. So 12 represents the command range. And another reason why the range is so important is that if units are caught outside of the command range, in certain cases, they can actually take step losses. Now, in this case, the counter itself is shown on its unused side. So it, like most counters, it has kind of a top view, which you can see here. Try to get it into focus here, but my camera seems to be moving kind of slow. And in addition, it also has what's known, there we go, with the white stripe on its used side. So whenever you go to activate a formation, you're going to flip the counter like that, and then basically at a glance that that is the active formation. So it's important as you kind of work on your strategy in this game to kind of be able to tell at a glance the formations by way of their headquarters that have yet to activate, the formation that is currently active, and then in some cases, there's actually a third way to position the counter per the rules, which is to indicate its done side. So if it's upside down on its use side, that's considered to be done, which means that that formation can no longer activate for that turn. Now, I mentioned the 12 on the back. There also, as you can see here, is an additional 12 on this side of the counter, and that's on the lower right. It's in black, and if you've played OCS before, you probably have an indicator that what that represents is its movement allowance. And black, this specific color, represents the type of movement, in this case truck. So red would be what's known as tack, white would be a leg movement allowance. The 3 with a little explosion in the background, that actually represents an artillery allotment for the HQ. Now every formation has to move or activate at least once in a turn. And at the end, when you come to the completion of the initial activation, you have the capability of continuing your forward momentum or your progress, and that's actually expressed in what's known as a reactivation roll. So you have the option, you can choose to do it, you don't have to roll a single die, and if it's this number or better, can be modified by something called fresh, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So in this case, a 4 or better, then you actually can keep your momentum rolling, and you can go in and do a second activation back to back. And it's actually either if that fails or after a second activation, that's the point at which you would actually switch the counter to done mode. Okay. A couple other things about headquarters units. You'll notice there that there's actually a fatigue marker that's off to the side. And we're not going to go into the concept of the snafu roll in this video. We will in the future. But there are a number of informational counters that you can have splayed out to the side of the headquarters counter. Here I only have one, but you might have others if the entire formation, for example, happens to be supported by other units. So for example, an anti-tank company or companies, you might have an informational counter like limited support, which says that the units in this formation actually is supported by anti-tank assets or something along those lines. There also are additional information counters, for example, this one, which is a coordination counter. And as I indicated a moment ago, the designer, he seems to indicate that having your formations kind of spread out is a bad thing. And he expresses this in what's known in the rules as your blob. So basically your formation has, it has some basic integrity to it. And if another formation comes in from the side and overlaps with it, and you kind of just test this with your eyeball. So basically if you see one formation overlap another, then you have what's known as a mixed dice roll modifier. Now, if 2 formations actually happen to enter the same hex, or there are a couple of other circumstances that can cause this, then you would actually have to have one formation HQ get on the phone and call another. And so that's what this coordination marker is representing. I tend to think of it, I know this is probably cliche, but I tend to think of it in the Patton movie whenever Patton is standing at the crossroads and he's actually doing the traffic cop drill, trying to get 2 formations to sequence their movements and basically utilize one intersection most efficiently. Okay, so let me just shift gears now, and we'll take a look at some of the specific units that are in this formation. Well, let's start off with the, how about this one right here? So what this is, let's have a look at this counter. It represents actually the, well, who is it actually? It looks like it is the 1st Battalion, 8th Regiment in this Kampfgruppe. And in this specific case, I think what we're looking at here is an armor battalion. So there's a lot of color coding. There are a lot of numbers on the counter. And let's just break them down one by one. So first, on this side, you can see basically the specific units identifier, as I just mentioned a moment ago. And here, you can see how many steps the units has, in this case 3. You can see that it's a battalion. It has a NATO symbol for being armor. It has the formation that it's assigned to, the name of the formation. This red number 2 here is pretty important. So this would be identified as what's known as a red AV unit, and that's its armor value 2. This number here, the 5, indicates that it has an action rating of 5. And there are things that this unit can do, and each of these numbers expresses a value in relation to the unit's capabilities. Sometimes these numbers work in concert, sometimes they don't. And we'll talk about that in later videos, but you know, unlike other games, when we play BCS, what we're not doing is trying to add and subtract and get the right ratios to have a maximal attack. It doesn't have an odds-based CRT. It basically uses a point system which is really focused on the action rating, and then if armor comes into play, also its AV value, which as you can see here is 2. This 14 represents, as I mentioned a moment ago with the headquarters, the black number 12 was for Trek. In this case, this is its movement allowance, and because it's red, what it's representing is the tactical type. Now if you flip it over, you can see here that the values, one of the values goes up, one of the values goes down. And so this side here, I believe this is, according to the rules, this is its movement side, and this side is its deployed side. So the armor value goes up a little bit, the movement allowance goes down. Okay, all right, cool. Here we have the 33rd. I think it's a battalion. It's got six steps, and this actually has one of the most important counter features that is expressed in the game. Let me just see if I can kind of get the camera to zoom in on it a little bit. So you see to the left of the 1, you have something that looks like an arrow, and indeed this is actually called the assault arrow. This game is interesting in that whenever armor units come into contact with one another, they will do something known as an engagement. So basically armor engages armor. But in order to actually attack a hex, you know, the hex next to you, with the intention of actually taking the hex or seizing the ground, you have to have something known as the assault arrow, which you can see here on this counter. Now, this is probably a poor choice straight out of the gate. Let me just switch over to another counter here. This looks like mechanized infantry, and indeed here they also have an assault arrow. So this basically, whenever you see this arrow, you know that this unit is capable of doing combat. Here you can see what their action rating would be, as well as their white leg movement on their deployed side. And putting it back here, the game comes with, I think these are called Pollard counters, if memory serves. So I've played TCS in the past, and they just have discrete counters that represent the number of steps, but in this case you actually have one counter and you rotate it, and whichever side is up, that indicates the number of steps that the unit has left. Now I'm putting this counter back on top of this counter, and you know, in most war games you're probably familiar with the concept of stacking. In this game I think the stack limit is 2. And stacking generally is bad. It's bad like it is in most war games because of artillery. You know, if you have a lot of men or vehicles that are clumped together in a small place and you pound it with artillery, then you're, you know, consequently going to get more step losses. And the same is true in this game. But I think actually the stacking limit is 2 units in a specific hex. Okay, so that's that. Now this actually is, it's just a setup of one formation from one of the scenarios from baptism by fire. But what's actually kind of interesting about the way this is set up is that you actually have three different types of units here. So, here I have the AV unit that I mentioned a moment ago. So this is like a tank battalion. Here I have mechanized infantry, right? So it has the assault arrow. And the reason why I hesitated at first to talk about this counter is because it has both. So you can see the assault arrow here, as well as the red AV number there. And indeed, this actually is, it is kind of mixed up, and that's actually a game feature. This is actually what's known as a dual unit. So it has the ability to engage armor from a distance. And actually, I should clarify that. When I say engage armor, engagements happen not only between armor against armor, but armor against, say, AT guns, or I think in the last Blitzkrieg, you might actually have some tank destroyers. So any type of of armor-piercing round that's traded between weapons platforms. That's really what the red AV number, or just the AV number in general, is expressing. But here, this is a dual unit, so it has an assault arrow in that it can actually do an attack on an adjacent hex, or it also has the capability of doing an engagement, which is not actually a contest over seizing ground, but rather it's just the weapons platforms engaging other weapons platforms. Okay, long-winded explanation. So let's move on to another counter. And these actually, so the first thing that should pop out is that this is a different color. And in this case, this is an Italian unit. This actually is from the Bersaglieri, and it's attached to the Kampfgruppe, the same Kampfgruppe that we've been working with. So just, the designer, he has a researcher, or the researcher has gone in and done extensive research about which units were assigned to which formations. And as you see kind of mixed formations coming together, sometimes they may have a unit attached. In this case, it looks like a mechanized infantry unit from the Bersaglieri. Now, you can see there it's got an action rating of 2. Compare that against its German counterparts, and then you start to get a little bit of the flavor of the historical billing. So I wonder if there's anything else that I may have left out about these units. I'm sure it'll come to my mind at some point. But these are the basic units that you'll find in a formation. So the units here, the headquarters here, the informational counters that are splayed out from a headquarters. One other very important counter that may be in this stack, if this was stacked together, might be the concept of support. So if I have AT guns that are actually in the form of a counter, and they're in support of the entire formation, then you'll keep the counter here next to the headquarters hex, but the counter really doesn't represent a physical unit that exists only in that hex. Rather, the counter would be in support of the units in this formation. So if you have, for example, an anti-tank company, you'll find some of the guns, they might be here with the Bersaglieri, they might be here with this 1st Battalion of the, I don't know who this is actually, I have to go and look at the designer's notes, but it looks like it's some Africa unit. Down here, you probably remember in the previous video that I did, I had made mention of the Fallschirmjäger, and they were the units that were in light blue. I don't think these are parachute units. I have done kind of a breeze through the back of the baptism by fire rules, and I think in this case these are reconstituted elements of Fallschirmjäger units that were put into new battalions. I think here you have the 1st and the 2nd Battalion of something called the 1st Jaeger. So Jaeger means hunter in German. I don't think those are tank destroyers, but nonetheless, they have kind of a historical root as being Fallschirmjäger, which is why they're in the sky blue. wanted to dig out from the counter tray a support unit. And I think in a couple of minutes I'll switch over and I'll talk about the different types of support. But if you have, as I mentioned, the physical counter as part of the splayed counters that are associated with a specific headquarters unit, it might be the case that the entire formation is considered in support. So what would that mean? Well, in this case, these are 88s, and they are assigned, they're actually from another formation. So this looks like Stenkoff, but let's just pretend like they were part of this formation. All right, so we put them in the hex, and in this case, we have something known as a standoff AV unit. So you could take another informational counter and you could put it, so all these counters here are associated with this headquarters. You'd have standoff support. And what this means whenever this counter is here and has the marker standoff support near it, is that the 88s that are contained from this counter are actually embedded within the other battalions in the formation, right? So if I were trucking along, right, let's just say in this case I had an American unit, and I realize this is not a unit counter, but let's just say that I had somebody approach along this track, one of these other units, then this counter here, standoff support, the 88s, could be used to fire anti-tank at the approaching unit. I'm actually going to take it out because this isn't a unit. I don't want it to be confusing. So again, this concept of support we'll talk about in a later video in detail, and we'll talk about it as it's expressed with its counters later in this video. But when you have it near a headquarters, basically the 88s that are contained as part of this counter are not physically represented by this counter in this hex, but rather are considered to be in support of or embedded in the other units in this formation. All right, so with that, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over now and talk a little bit more about the informational counters to give a little bit of an introduction to some of the rules. And that is what the rules are behind the actual counter that's a representation of it. Okay, so support, it comes in 3 different flavors. So there's red support, there is limited support being support that is considered to be more defensive in nature, and then there is standoff support. Standoff support's a little different than the other two. The reason why is because as you're moving up and engaging support, the support really acts in a defensive capacity against the, let's say, for example, approaching armor. Standoff support's a little bit different. So the 88s is an example. These actually have the ability to initiate an engagement and can act with a little bit more of an offensive punch. One thing that I think I forgot to say this a moment ago, but I want to make it absolutely clear, is that, and let me find a good example counter. Support can only be in support of an assault arrow counter. So it wouldn't make any sense, for example, to have support supporting a red AV unit, right? I mean, if you have, I don't know exactly what type of tanks these represent. I think these are probably Mark IIIs or something along those lines. But it wouldn't make any sense to actually have a bunch of anti-tank guns that were, driving along with tanks and providing anti-tank support to an armor battalion, right? So instead, you would associate those with an assault arrow unit, which might, be an infantry battalion, and then the anti-tank units, as limited support, would be providing some protection against armor that was approaching it. And that's the concept of an engagement. There actually is, in this game, in fact, let me just kind of go ahead and just set up maybe not a full example, but just kind of in brief. Let's just say that these two units were opposed to each other. this was back at the headquarters for this unit, and the armor approached an infantry battalion that had support. In order for the armor actually to enter the hex in a form of overrun that exists in BCS, it would actually have to do something called drop support of this unit. So whether they fired smoke rounds or whether they actually shot directly at the anti-tank guns or what have you, in some form or fashion through an engagement, this unit would have to cause this unit to have its support dropped. And that's actually expressed in some other counters that we have, which are associated with support. You can see them here. It's the support dropped counter on the one hand, and the other flavor of it, which is the temporary support dropped counter. Now, in the case that I just mentioned a moment ago, let's say that the armor had a successful engagement against the infantry and was able to drop its support. At that point, you would actually place a temporarily dropped or temp support dropped counter on the unit. If that unit somehow was isolated from the rest of its formation, and I'm speaking pretty generically here with reference to the rules, but not giving you the exact rule. But if at the end of the formation it was kind of isolated from the rest of its unit and it didn't have a path back to the headquarters hex, then the temp would actually be converted into a support dropped, which means that the condition remains beyond that particular activation. So there you go. Those are the support counters and kind of the explanation of temp and temporarily drop support and drop support. We talked about this a moment ago whenever I was talking about activating the actual headquarters counter. So there is the concept of the snafu roll in BCS, and as your units move forward in this game, just basic laws of inertia and like diminishing returns or something along those lines. You're going to start to run out of fuel, things are going to start to break, and your offensive, the momentum that your offensive has actually is going to lessen over time. And that wear and tear on a specific formation is represented by these, which are called fatigue counters. So one of the interesting facets about this game is kind of the way, whenever you activate a formation, you manage your fatigue. If you just, if you motor on without engaging, you probably won't actually, unless you shoot at somebody, increase your fatigue. But if you actually engage in combat or something along those lines, chances are at the end of a formation, you might change and increase your fatigue by 1. So say from a 1 to a 2, 2 to a 3, 3 to a 4, what have you. One thing about having fatigue 4, so let's say you had the headquarters. Where did I put the headquarters? Let's say you had the headquarters unit, and I don't think I mentioned this, but probably needs to be on a road. Once you actually move to fatigue 4, you no longer have the ability to do a second activation. So this is kind of the trade-off in the game, and part of the strategy and tactics, is how aggressively do you want to attack, knowing that you're going to accrue fatigue throughout the game, and this trade-off, and that's where a lot of the planning comes in that you execute through the game mechanics. Pretty cool stuff. So here we also have an MSR blocked counter. So let me just hit pause for a second so I can set up this concept. Okay, so if you recall, we have, it's not, I've kind of messed the formation up a little bit, but, let's just say that we have our formation more or less as we originally found it over here. And let's say, it went from its use to its done side. It was coordinated. It had some fatigue accrue to it. It's no longer in support, yada, yada, yada. Okay, if you'll notice, the combat train here, which I think has to be on a road, right? The combat train actually is going to trace along a path towards a map edge, and that is considered to be its main supply route. And you know, a game mechanic, not just for BCS, but for any other games, is basically to go in and cut lines of supply. So basically, if this traced back to the board edge, and in BCS they actually have letters on the side of the map, what you might find is that there are other units that are preventing supply from coming forward and reaching the formation. That's what this MSR blocked counter represents, is the level at which, or the time and level at which the main supply route from a train running back to the map edge has been blocked. One other thing about this, you know, you'll notice the distance of the train in relation to the headquarters. And this game actually has a concept called optimal distance. So you'll find in the game that combat trains are rarely close to a formation headquarters. And in fact, they're considered to be at optimal distance if they are 5 to 15 hexes behind the headquarters. And behind is the key, because you obviously wouldn't put your trains out in front of the formation in the general direction that you're attacking. Okay, so back over to the informational counters again, and let me get some of these unit counters out of the way. So we've talked about support, right? We've talked about temporary, there. We've talked about the Pollard counters. We've talked about the concept of fatigue. Now, these are some interesting counters here, and let's just take them one by one. The first one is an OBJ, which is an objective. So in this game, you know, you can't just activate a formation and basically decide, you know, on the fly as you're going through the formation's activation exactly what your objective is going to be. I think the game designer considers that to be a little bit inaccurate, you know, that you would actually move some counters forward, roll some dice, see what happens, and then on the basis of what happens, actually pump more units into that area. So instead, at the beginning of a formation's activation, you actually have to take what's known as an objective counter, and you actually have to place it. And placing has to occur against an enemy unit. So in this case, if this was considered the enemy, you might have an objective counter which is pointing to where the enemy objective is on the board. I think you know, it makes more sense to actually put a position on the map, but if you read through the designer's notes of the last Blitzkrieg, in playtesting they found that that led to some abuses of the rules, and so instead the objective has to label a unit and not a specific hex. Now there is a concept in this game called a double objective, which most of the players call a double tap, and so if you put 2 objective markers on a unit, then that'll give you some significant die roll modifiers that not only count for assaulting a specific hex, but also for engaging units that might be within, in this case, it's a 2 hex distance from what the objective is. So, you know, if you have the objective here, then basically it's going to radiate out 2 hexes from the unit that marks its center. New in 1.1, specifically in Baptism by Fire, is also a screen counter, and this actually is a new rule called screening. So I'm not going to go into it in too great detail, but if you were to mark, let's say it was an armor unit with a screen counter, then basically as opposing units go at this armor unit, the screen effectively limits their offensive options. You know, so basically it's kind of strung out in the desert and kind of doing a fighting withdrawal, or just acting as an impediment to an oncoming formation that may want something behind that unit as its objective. So instead of this unit actually taking damage, and this is just if memory serves correctly how the rules work, the screen basically will limit the ability for the offensive unit to actually take offensive action. You know, as they approach and they try to do damage, you know, the screen causes this unit to actually pull back whenever it's attacked. We also have a couple of counters, and I pulled these out. It's kind of interesting. They have different graphics on them. So the left one is from the last Blitzkrieg. The right one has a little bit of a desert theme from Baptism of Fire. So this counter is stopped, and what ends up happening is that if you have one unit attack another, so let's say, and I realize this is contrived, but let's just say you have the armor unit attacking, this Jaeger unit. If this Jaeger unit were to retreat, then in the hex that it retreated from, there would be, there might be contents of the unit's supply or things of that nature that are, just arrayed along the roads or whatever. In some way, the vehicles might be rushing backwards and causing a traffic situation. And in that case, you would put a stopped counter whenever a retreat occurs. There's actually, I think, a couple other reasons why you might put a stopped counter down, like a failed engagement. But any offensive unit that goes into a hex marked with a traffic stop counter is, upon entering that hex, considered to have its movement stopped at that moment. Okay, a few more counters to go here in this video. And what I've got collected here are a few, I don't know, I guess you could call them like defensive counters. So these two counters will definitely be splayed out next to a headquarters hex. So this first one here is a prepared defense. What this counter represents is a formation that has, as the name implies, has had the time to dig in, set its artillery for defensive fire, final fire. Basically the formation is ready to receive an attack. And so, being in prepared defense gives a die roll modifier to certain combat situations. The way the game works, though, you have to plan ahead. And in the concept of a game turn, there are multiple multiple activations by individual formations. There actually is a phase before the formation activations, which is called the administration phase. And in the newer version of the rules, 1.1, you have to make a determination then as to whether or not you do or do not want your formations to go into prepared defense, what's commonly called prep def. And that's a significant change from the 1.0 to the 1.1 rules. But again, what this represents is that the unit has had time to dig in. And the trade-off between the DRM that you get as a defensive bonus against the units that are attacking you is that you only have the ability to move basically half of your movement allowance or allotment. And there are other restrictions that keep you from kind of popping out of prepared defense and kind of winging it and going on the offensive. So a unit that is in prepared defense actually has a negative DRM to its attack roll. Again, it has a limitation to its movement. It can't have full movement in a game turn. So going into prepared defense is something that you have to think about quite a bit as to whether or not you think the trade-off is worth it as a benefit for the entire game turn. Now, one thing that you need in order to go into prepared defense is you actually have to have access to at least 1 point of artillery. And these counters here represent artillery points of various strengths. And they are to be distinguished from this here, which represents an air point. Right, so both artillery as well as air support are kind of abstracted in this game in compared to other games. So obviously abstracted in the sense that you don't have a physical aircraft counter, but rather you just have access to air points that work very similar from a barrage perspective as the way that arty points work. And in this game you actually have access to 2 different types of artillery. So in this case, this represents an artillery point that might come and might be given to a specific formation on the basis of the specific scenario. And these are over and above what you might have in terms of intrinsic artillery that is physically represented on the headquarters counter. So if I were to activate this specific formation, then they would actually have, and let's say that they had next to their headquarters counter the 2 artillery point here, they would have access to 5 points of artillery during that activation. And I think actually this turns over. So if you have a second activation in that one game turn, or definitely in the next activation in the next game turn, you have access to both the 3 intrinsic as well as the 2 assigned by the scenario. Okay. A couple other things. So new to baptism by fire are mines. This didn't exist in, at least to my knowledge, in the last Blitzkrieg. There's actually a forthcoming game as well that introduces wire, and not in the form of a counter, but it also has defensive fortifications called forts, which are actually expressed on the map. So as additional games in the series come out, you'll see different types of defensive things expressed in both counter and map form. And then finally, the last set of counters that we have are game-specific situations, right? So counters that represent something that happened on the board. So in this case, these both reference in the last Blitzkrieg the situations relating to the bridges that were in the initial portion of that campaign. So you have here the Greif teams, which it's been a while since I played that, but I think these represented the German units, not commandos per se, but the people who were specifically assigned to go in and agitate and make sure that bridges did not get blown. And if they failed in their task, you would mark a bridge on the map with a blown counter if the Allies were successfully able to blow the bridge before their defense. I don't think, I'm looking around at the table right now, and I don't see any specific ones that leap out at me from baptism by fire, but these are definitely specific situations that exist in the last Blitzkrieg. So, a few other counters, I'm not going to show them to you, I'll just mention them, but obviously you have game counters that represent the day, the weather, things of that nature. The support dropped counters, I think I forgot to mention a moment ago that they have both gray as well as green, so they actually are side specific. You can associate them with a specific formation. And then if you want to take a look at the way the actual counter sheet comes, I was actually doing some clipping today. And here we have actually the counter sheet from baptism by fire. Now, obviously, I've punched all of my Germans and Italians, but in this case, we have the American formations. So you can see the formation identifiers up here, as well as the Commonwealth in brown and the Americans in green, and the French in blue with step loss Pollard counters here. And I'll go ahead and put this to the side. And let me just try to pick up the camera here and move it back. Bring the baptism by fire box into focus. And just mention that this is the end of the video. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I'm not exactly sure what I want to cover next time, but I'll think of something. So I've got 2 videos at this point. Now might be a good point actually to go in and search for, there's a video on BCS that actually covers an activation, including the concept of snafu, and basically, here with these counters, I've talked a lot about what happens to a formation as expressed by the numbers on its counters and the various informational counters. But if you really want to get a flavor for a specific activation, I think Rick Van Dyke has an activation video. You might want to search for that and watch that one next. And then I'll try to put something together to come after this as my 3rd video. So thanks again for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.